The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as Tom Wilson gripped his steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through his slightly cracked window, but his mind was elsewhere. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left their mark, not in visible scars, but in the way his heart raced at unexpected moments and how everyday sounds could suddenly transport him back to those dusty streets halfway across the world. Today wasn't supposed to be different from any other day. He'd woken up at dawn, as usual, his military habits still ruling his civilian life. The small apartment he called home felt emptier than usual, with only the gentle whir of his old fan keeping him company. His morning routine was simple: coffee, meditation, as his counselor had suggested, and a quick check of his VA paperwork. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way his hands wouldn't stop shaking, or how the morning traffic seemed unusually loud. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror caught him off guard. Red and blue reflections danced across his dashboard, making his chest tighten. He followed his instincts, carefully pulling over to the curb, trying to remember. The police officer studied the expired registration with a practiced eye, while Tom fought to keep his breathing steady. His fingers tapped an irregular rhythm on the steering wheel, not from defiance, but from the tremors he'd been battling since running out of his medication. The morning that had started with such routine was quickly becoming anything but. "Sir, are you aware your registration expired 3 months ago?" The officer's tone remained professional, but Tom could hear the slight edge of concern creeping in. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come easily. How could he explain that keeping track of registration dates felt impossible when he was struggling just to make it through each day? The VA appointment system had become his personal maze. Every phone call led to another automated message, every online form redirected to another webpage. Processing, that's what they kept telling him. His medication request was processing. His appeal was processing. His whole life felt like it was stuck in processing, and now here he was, trying to explain this to someone who probably just wanted to write a simple ticket and move on with their day. Yes, officer," Tom managed to say, his voice rougher than he intended. "I've been trying to." He paused, watching a school bus pass by in his side mirror. The yellow blur triggered a memory of desert sand, and he had to grip the steering wheel harder to stay present. "There's been some complications with my paperwork." The officer noticed his white-knuckled grip on the wheel, the slight shake in his hands as he tried to gather his thoughts. That hand shifted slightly, moving closer to their radio, a subtle movement that Tom's military-trained eyes caught immediately. His heart rate spiked, and the world started to take on that tunnel vision quality he knew all too well. "Could you step out of the vehicle, please?" The officer's request was standard procedure, but to Tom's ears, it sounded like an order echoing across a battlefield. He knew he should comply smoothly, show that he wasn't a threat. That's what the civilian readjustment counselor had taught him: slow movements, clear communication, stay calm. But his body wasn't cooperating. The car felt like a safe haven, a metal bubble protecting him from the chaos his mind was creating. Outside, the morning traffic continued its steady flow, each passing vehicle sending vibrations through his seat. A motorcycle backfired somewhere down the street, and Tom's whole body tensed. "Sir, I need you to exit the vehicle now." The officer's voice had taken on that firm, authoritative tone that Tom recognized from his own military days. He knew he should respond, explain about the VA appointments, the medication issues, the way his mind sometimes slipped between past and present like a faulty radio signal. With deliberate slowness, Tom reached for his seatbelt. The click of the release seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. His dog tags clinked softly against his chest as he moved, the familiar sound helping to anchor him to reality. He kept wearing them even after discharge. Sometimes they were the only thing that felt real when the world started spinning. As he opened the car door, the morning air hit him full force. The smell of fresh-cut grass from nearby lawns mixed with exhaust fumes from passing cars. Somewhere, a neighbor was burning leaves. The smoke carried on the breeze brought unwanted memories of other kinds of smoke, other kinds of mornings. His legs felt unsteady as he stood. The sidewalk seemed to waver slightly under his feet, like the deck of a ship in rough seas. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, assessing his movements, probably noting the way he swayed slightly. How could he explain that it wasn't alcohol or drugs, but the absence of medication that was making him unstable? The morning had grown busier while he'd been sitting in his car. More people were out now, joggers with earbuds, parents walking their kids to school, elderly couples taking their morning constitutionals. Each person who slowed to look made Tom's skin crawl with unwanted attention. He'd spent years learning to scan crowds for threats. Now every curious glance felt like a potential danger. Traffic continued to flow around them, creating a backdrop of white noise that should have been soothing but instead set his nerves more on edge. A delivery truck rumbled past, its diesel engine growling like the military transports that used to carry his unit through dangerous territories. The sound seemed to fill his head, drowning out the officer's next words. His military training screamed at him to maintain situational awareness, but his civilian counseling urged him to focus on breathing, to stay grounded in the present moment. The two sets of instincts warred within him as he stood there, trying to appear normal while his world threatened to slip sideways into chaos. The officer was speaking again, something about his behavior seeming erratic. Tom wanted to explain, to make them understand that what looked like suspicious behavior was actually a man fighting to stay present, to not let the past overwhelm him. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind years of training not to show weakness, not to reveal vulnerability. Everything changed in an instant. A delivery truck rounded the corner too fast, its heavy wheels hitting a pothole with a thunderous bang. The sound ripped through the quiet morning like a gunshot, and Tom's world shifted dramatically. One moment he was standing on a peaceful suburban street, the next he was somewhere else entirely. The crisp autumn air disappeared, replaced by the thick, hot atmosphere he remembered all too well. His mind couldn't tell the difference between the delivery truck's echo and the sounds that had haunted his dreams for years. The peaceful neighborhood blurred and transformed in his vision. The neat rows of maple trees became scattered buildings, the passing cars morphed into military vehicles. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, falling back on years of training that had kept him alive in combat zones. He took 2 steps backward, his stance automatically shifting to what his instructors had drilled into him during countless training sessions. His breathing changed, quick, shallow breaths that prepared his body for action. The officer noticed the change immediately. One moment they had been dealing with a routine traffic stop. The next, they were facing someone whose entire demeanor had transformed. They could see it in Tom's eyes, the way they darted around, not really seeing the actual street but something else, something far away. "Sir, I need you to stay where you are," the officer called out, their voice firm but calm. But to Tom's ears, the words merged with memories of other commands, other voices. The sound of passing traffic became the rumble of distant explosions. A kid's laughter from a nearby yard transformed into radio chatter. Even the morning sunlight felt different, harsh and blinding, like desert glare. His hand instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there, finding only empty air where his service rifle should have been. This small detail, the missing weight of his weapon, was like a splash of cold water, creating a moment of confusion between his past and present realities. More cars were slowing down now, drivers curious about the scene unfolding on their ordinary morning commute. Each new pair of headlights, each flash of sunlight off a windshield, sent new waves of anxiety through Tom's system. His heart was racing, pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The world had become too bright, too loud, too dangerous. The officer was speaking into their radio now, calling for backup. The words floated through the air. Possible crisis situation. Subject appears distressed. Tom knew he should try to explain, to tell them about the flashbacks, about how the medication helped him stay anchored in reality. But his voice seemed locked away, trapped in another time and place. A gentle breeze stirred the fallen leaves around his feet, creating a soft, rustling sound. This small, peaceful noise managed to penetrate the chaos in his mind. It reminded him of the grounding exercises his therapist had taught him. Focus on the present, find something real to hold onto. He tried to count his breaths like he'd learned in therapy. 1, 2, 3, but another car backfired in the distance, and the counting scattered like leaves in a storm. His hands were shaking more violently now, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The officer had picked up on his distress, their posture changing from authoritative to cautious. They'd dealt with veterans before. It was part of their training, but each situation was unique, each person's struggle different. They kept their distance, maintaining a careful balance between duty and compassion. Somewhere in the background, Tom could hear the approaching sirens of backup units. The high-pitched wail cut through his confusion like a knife, adding another layer of sensory overload to his already overwhelmed system. He wanted to cover his ears, to block out the noise, but years of training kept his hands visible, even as his mind struggled to separate reality from memory. More people were gathering now, watching from behind their car windows or from the safety of their front yards. Each new face, each movement in his peripheral vision demanded his attention. His military training screamed at him to scan for threats, while his civilian mind tried desperately to remember where he was, a quiet street, a traffic stop, not a combat zone. The world seemed to pulse around him, expanding and contracting with each racing heartbeat. Colors were too bright, sounds too sharp. Everything felt dangerous and safe at the same time, real and unreal. He could feel sweat running down his back, his shirt sticking to his skin just like it used to in the desert heat, even though the autumn morning was cool. Time began to lose meaning. Seconds stretched into hours, then compressed into split-second snapshots. A bird flying overhead. A car door slamming. The rustle of leaves in the wind. Each sound, each movement became both a potential threat and a lifeline to reality. He stood there, caught between two worlds, trying to find his way back to the present moment. The officer watched as Tom stood frozen in place, his eyes focused on something no one else could see. But there was something hauntingly familiar about his expression, something that stirred memories of quiet Sunday dinners and late-night conversations with their own brother, who had returned from overseas service 3 years ago. It was that same distant look, that same tension in the shoulders, the slight tremor in the hands. The officer had seen it countless times across their family dinner table, watched their brother struggle with invisible battles while trying to eat Mum's pot roast. The recognition hit like a wave, washing away the standard protocol and replacing it with understanding. The approaching sirens grew louder, but the officer made a quick decision. Raising one hand, they used their radio to call off the incoming backup. "Stand down," they said quietly into their shoulder mic. "Possible veteran in crisis. I can handle this." The words felt strange in their mouth, not because they weren't true, but because they marked such a dramatic shift from the routine traffic stop this had started as. Looking closer now, they noticed more signs they should have seen earlier. The military precision in how the car was parked, despite Tom's apparent distress. The perfectly aligned stack of papers on the passenger seat. The way he had initially responded to commands with instinctive discipline before things started to unravel. A memory surfaced of their brother trying to explain what these moments felt like. "It's like being in two places at once," he had said late one night, sitting on the back porch, the stars bright overhead. "Your body is here, but your mind is thousands of miles away, fighting battles that ended years ago." The officer took a careful step forward, making sure to stay visible while keeping their hands clear of their equipment. They remembered how sudden movements could make their brother flinch, how certain sounds could trigger a cascade of memories. The morning traffic continued to flow at a distance, creating a backdrop of white noise. "I have a brother who served," they said, keeping their voice steady and calm. Not too loud, not too soft, just conversational, like sharing a story over coffee. He was with the 10th Mountain Division, came home in 2020. The words seemed to float in the space between them, an offering of understanding. Tom's eyes flickered briefly, a moment of recognition cutting through the haze of memory. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, slowed just slightly. The officer noticed the change and continued, drawing from years of watching their brother navigate his own struggles. "He has days like this too," they said, taking another small step forward. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, sending a scatter of leaves across the pavement between them. Days when the world gets too loud, too bright. Days when the past feels more real than the present. The tension in Tom's shoulders eased fractionally. His eyes began to focus, moving from invisible threats to actual surroundings. The officer could see him fighting to stay present, recognized the same battle they'd witnessed in their brother countless times. Around them, the neighborhood continued its morning routine. A school bus passed in the distance, its yellow bulk reflecting the morning sun. A dog barked in a nearby yard. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, but the officer knew how quickly they could transform into something else in a mind trained to expect danger. They thought about their brother's service dog, how its presence helped anchor him in difficult moments. "Do you have someone we can call?" they asked gently. "Or maybe a service animal at home?" The questions were simple, focused on the present, offering Tom something concrete to hold on to. Traffic had thinned out now, most of the morning commuters having moved on. The few remaining onlookers were starting to disperse, their curiosity fading as the situation appeared less dramatic than they'd hoped. The officer was grateful for the decreasing audience. They'd seen how their brother struggled with being watched during his harder moments. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the street. A gentle breeze carried the scent of somebody's fresh-cut lawn, a normal, peaceful smell that seemed to help ground Tom further in the present. His hands had stopped shaking quite so badly, though they still trembled slightly at his sides. The officer thought about all the times they'd sat with their brother, waiting out the storm of memories, learning the hard way what helped and what didn't. They thought about the frustration in his voice when he talked about dealing with the VA, about medication delays and endless paperwork. Looking at Tom now, they could see the same exhaustion their brother often showed, not just physical tiredness, but the bone-deep weariness that came from constantly navigating between two worlds. They recognized the signs of someone fighting battles long after leaving the battlefield, someone trying to find their footing in a world that often didn't understand their struggles. The morning had grown warmer as the officer gestured toward a wooden bench beneath a maple tree, just off the sidewalk. "Why don't we sit down for a minute?" they suggested, their voice carrying the same gentle tone they used when their brother was having a rough day. The bench offered some privacy from the occasional curious glance of passing cars. Tom hesitated for a moment, his military training still battling with his civilian instincts. The officer purposely sat first, choosing the end of the bench that left Tom with a clear view of the street. Another lesson learned from their brother about the importance of maintaining situational awareness during moments of anxiety. "I've got some water in my car," the officer offered, remembering how dehydration could make these episodes worse. "Would you like some?" The question was simple, straightforward, giving Tom something concrete to focus on. He managed a slight nod, his first real response since the flashback began. While the officer retrieved the water, Tom's gaze swept across the street in practiced movements. The familiar routine of scanning his surroundings seemed to help calm him further. The officer noticed this and began quietly naming things they could both see: the red bicycle leaning against a garage door, the wind chimes tinkling on a nearby porch, the morning glory vines climbing up a mailbox post. "My brother taught me about grounding techniques," they explained, passing Tom the water bottle. "He says sometimes it helps to name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear." They let the words trail off, not pushing, just offering the technique as a possibility. Tom's hands were steadier now as he accepted the water. The cool bottle against his palms provided another anchor to reality. He took a careful sip, and the officer could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders. The simple act of drinking water seemed to help bridge the gap between past and present. "The VA's been backed up," Tom said finally, his voice rough but present. The words came slowly at first, like he was remembering how to have a normal conversation. "I ran out of my medication 3 days ago. Been trying to get it refilled, but..." He gestured vaguely, a movement that spoke of countless hours spent on hold, endless transfers between departments, and a system that sometimes seemed designed to test the very patients it was supposed to help maintain. The officer nodded, thinking of their brother's similar struggles. "The paperwork never ends, does it?" they said, keeping their tone conversational. A small smile flickered across Tom's face, the first sign of real connection since this whole situation began. The morning traffic had settled into its between rush hours lull. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower started up, its steady drone providing a predictable background noise. A mail carrier walked past on the opposite side of the street, their routine marking the normal progression of the day. "My brother found some good people at the Veterans Support Network," the officer mentioned, watching as a fall leaf spiraled down between them. "They helped him navigate the system, got him connected with the right resources. Sometimes it just takes knowing which doors to knock on." Tom ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed to help him stay focused on the present. "I've heard of them," he said. "Never got around to reaching out. Kept thinking I could handle it on my own." The admission carried the weight of many similar thoughts, shared by many similar veterans. The officer pulled out their phone, but kept it face down on their leg, non-threatening. "I've got some numbers," they said. "People who actually pick up when you call." My brother helped put together a list, sort of an unofficial guide to getting things done in the system. A school bell rang in the distance, its familiar sound marking the start of another ordinary day. But here on the bench, something extraordinary was happening. Two strangers finding common ground in shared experiences and understanding. "You know what my brother says?" The officer continued, their voice carrying a hint of warmth. "He says the hardest part isn't what happened over there. The hardest part is feeling alone in dealing with it back here." They watched as these words settled between them, seeing recognition in Tom's eyes. Time seemed to move differently now, no longer fragmented by anxiety but flowing more naturally. The morning sun had warmed the bench, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. These simple sensations helped anchor the moment in peaceful reality rather than troubled memory. In this quiet moment, both the officer and Tom understood something important. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to reach out to another human being. The officer thought about their brother, about how many other veterans might be out there, fighting similar battles on quiet morning streets. Instead of reaching for a ticket book, the officer pulled out their personal phone. Years of watching their brother navigate the complex web of veteran services had taught them that sometimes the most important thing wasn't following procedure, it was knowing who to call. "Let me try something," they said, fingers moving across the screen with purpose. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the maple leaves above them as they waited for the call to connect. Tom sat quietly, his breathing now steady and even, the water bottle empty beside him. A friendly voice answered on the third ring. The officer's face brightened with recognition. "Hey, it's me," they said warmly. "Remember that favor you owe me? I think I found a way for you to repay it." Their free hand gestured reassuringly to Tom as they explained the situation, the expired registration, the VA delays, the medication issues. The person on the other end of the line must have said something encouraging because the officer's smile grew wider. "Really? You can do that today?" They glanced at Tom, hope evident in their expression. "Yeah, he's right here with me." "Hold on." They covered the phone speaker with their hand. "There's someone who wants to talk to you. She runs the local Veterans Support Network. My brother says she works miracles with the VA system." They offered the phone to Tom, who hesitated for just a moment before accepting it. The conversation that followed was like watching a door slowly open after years of being stuck shut. Tom's responses started short, yes, no, simple answers. But as the person on the other end spoke, his posture began to change. His shoulders relaxed. His free hand stopped its nervous tapping against his leg. The officer busied themselves with some paperwork, giving Tom privacy while keeping a protective presence nearby. They could hear fragments of the conversation, something about emergency prescriptions, about a clinic that specialized in veteran care, about support groups that met every Tuesday evening. A delivery truck rumbled past, but this time Tom barely noticed. He was too focused on writing down information on a notepad the officer had quietly provided. His handwriting was precise, military neat, as he noted down addresses, phone numbers, names of people who could help. When the call ended, Tom handed back the phone with hands that were completely steady for the first time that morning. "They can see me at 2 o'clock, he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Today. They said they can help with the medication right away." The officer nodded, unsurprised. They'd seen the same network work similar miracles for their brother. "They're good people," they said simply. "They understand how the system works and how it doesn't work sometimes." But they weren't done yet. The officer made another call, this time to a friend at the DMV. The conversation was brief but productive. "Oak," they said after hanging up. "They can squeeze you in tomorrow morning for the registration renewal. I explained the situation. They'll expedite it." Tom looked down at the notepad in his hands, at the list of resources and contacts that had materialized in the space of 2 phone calls. "I don't know what to say," he began, but the officer shook their head. "You don't have to say anything," they replied. "Just promise you'll follow up with these people. They want to help. That's why they're there." They paused, then added, "And my brother's group meets on Thursday nights. They're a good bunch. No pressure, but if you're interested." The morning had warmed considerably now. The early rush hour traffic had given way to the quieter rhythm of a regular day. Across the street, someone was watering their garden, the spray catching the sunlight and creating tiny rainbows. The officer reached into their pocket and pulled out what should have been a ticket book. Instead, they produced a business card. "My direct line," they explained, holding it out. "In case you need anything. Or in case you just want to talk to someone who understands a little bit about what you're going through." Time had transformed what started as a routine traffic stop into something much more meaningful. The officer thought about their brother, about how one person reaching out had changed his entire journey. Sometimes the smallest actions, a phone call, a kind word, a moment of understanding, could alter the course of someone's life. A cardinal landed on a nearby branch, its bright red feathers a splash of color against the autumn leaves. Tom watched it for a moment, then turned back to the officer. His eyes were clear now, present in a way they hadn't been earlier. "You know," he said quietly, "I was starting to think nobody understood." 6 months later, the same bench under the maple tree had become a regular meeting spot. The officer would often stop by during their patrol, sometimes bringing coffee from the local diner. Today, they found Tom already waiting there, looking relaxed in a way that would have seemed impossible on that crucial morning half a year ago. "Big day today," Tom said as the officer sat down, handing them a coffee cup. The morning was crisp, winter slowly giving way to early spring. The maple tree above them was showing the first hints of budding leaves. First time speaking to the new recruits at the academy. The officer smiled, remembering how their simple act of understanding had sparked a chain reaction within the department. What had started as one traffic stop had grown into something much bigger. Tom's story had reached the police chief, who recognized an opportunity to better serve their community's veterans. "The training program you helped design," the officer said, taking a sip of coffee, "it's making a real difference. Last week, Officer Chen used your techniques with a veteran having trouble at the grocery store. Turned a potential crisis into a connection to services." Tom nodded, his eyes clear and focused. The regular medication, therapy sessions, and support group meetings had worked wonders. But it wasn't just the professional help. It was the community he'd found, the purpose he'd discovered in helping others understand the invisible battles many veterans faced. "You know what the best part is?" Tom said, watching a jogger pass by with their dog. "When I talk to these officers, I can see it in their eyes. They're not just listening because they have to. They want to understand. They want to help." He paused, collecting his thoughts. That morning, when you recognized what was happening, it changed everything. The officer thought about how much had changed in 6 months. The department had established new protocols for identifying and assisting veterans in crisis. They'd formed partnerships with local veteran support organizations, creating a network of resources that was already showing positive results. "Remember that guy from last month?" the officer asked. "The one having trouble at the hardware store?" Tom nodded. He'd been called in to help with that situation. He just joined your Thursday night group, said it was the first time he felt someone really understood what he was going through. A school bus rolled past, its familiar rumble no longer triggering anxiety for Tom. Instead, it was just another part of the morning symphony, along with the birds in the trees, the distant lawnmowers, and the everyday sounds of a community going about its business. "The VA coordinator called yesterday," Tom mentioned, a hint of pride in his voice. "They want to use our program as a model for other districts. Said they've never seen such good cooperation between law enforcement and veteran services." He smiled, remembering how impossible such progress had seemed just 6 months ago. The officer watched as another patrol car drove by, the officer inside waving in recognition. "You know what my brother said?" they asked, turning back to Tom. "He said seeing you speak at the academy gave him hope. Made him feel like his own struggles had meaning, like they could help make things better for others." Tom reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Its pages were filled with ideas, strategies, and notes from countless conversations with other veterans. "Got 3 new volunteers for the mentorship program," he said. all former military, all wanting to help bridge the gap between veterans and law enforcement. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the bench despite the lingering chill in the air. A postal worker walked past, greeting them both by name. They'd become familiar faces in the neighborhood. The officer remembered that first morning how close they'd come to handling things by the book instead of with understanding. "Chief wants to expand the training," Tom continued, his voice animated with purpose, "not just for new recruits anymore. They're talking about making it part of regular in-service training for all officers." He paused, then added quietly, maybe if something like this had existed before. The officer understood what he meant. How many other veterans had faced similar situations without finding understanding? How many opportunities for connection and help had been missed simply because people didn't know what to look for or how to help? A group of elementary school kids walked by, their backpacks bouncing, their chatter filling the morning air. Tom watched them pass, remembering how 6 months ago, every loud noise, every sudden movement had been a potential trigger. Now he could appreciate these moments of everyday life for what they were, signs of the peace he'd fought to protect. "You know what the best part is?" the officer said, finishing their coffee. "It's not just about helping veterans anymore. It's about showing everyone that understanding and compassion can change lives, one traffic stop at a time." They smiled, remembering that crucial morning. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments.